It was perhaps the most lucrative criminal racket in history. Between 1979 and 1984, the Sicilian mafia smuggled nearly $2 billion worth of heroin into the US. It made mobsters on both sides of the Atlantic rich. It also led to war. In Sicily, rival bosses fought for control of the heroin trafficking empire. The terror this war unleashed drove one godfather to break omertà, the mafia's sacred code of silence. His act of betrayal would lead to a transatlantic assault on the mafia and make the first serious dent in their worldwide power. Heroin was flooding into the United States in the late 1970s, smuggled inside Italian food products and distributed through pizzerias owned by the Sicilian mafia. It was known as the Pizza Connection. The US faced an epidemic of heroin addiction. But for American gangsters, heroin meant money, and lots of it. Henry Hill was a mafia drug wholesaler in New York. Later, his life of crime was immortalized in the Hollywood blockbuster, Goodfellas. Hill would pick up heroin from pizzerias owned by Sicilian mafiosi, then supply it to dealers across the city. Even for a low-ranking mobster like Hill, the profits were enormous.
The amount of money that I made was astronomical. I mean, you make 20, 30,000 a day at the wholesale. I mean, I'm serious. Shopping bags full. I didn't have places to put the money. And it accumulated so quickly, you know, that's a whole nother lifestyle. A whole nother lifestyle, because, you know, you go from, you know, a few $100,000 to millions quickly, you know.
This is where the drugs were coming from. Palermo, the capital of Sicily. In the catacombs beneath the city, bodies lie preserved for posterity. In Palermo, a cult of death has been a tradition for centuries. In the 1980s, death loomed over the island once again. A bloody mafia war was raging. The prize, control of the heroin trade to America. It was a war started by a ferocious mafia gang from the village of Corleone. Corleone was a mafia stronghold set high in the mountains of central Sicily. It was the place that gave its name to Marlon Brando's character in the film The Godfather. The leader of the Corleone crime family was a killer called Totò Riina. Riina became known simply as the Beast. In 1981 and 1982, bodies of Riina's victims were turning up on the streets of Palermo every 3 days. Yet a wall of silence meant bringing the killers to justice was impossible. One night in Corleone, a rival of Riina was shot dead outside the building where the town council was meeting. It was a night that Dino Paternostro remembers clearly.
We went downstairs and found a body on the street. I was only 25 years old, and I said to the mayor, "Let's phone the Carabinieri." He looked straight at me and said, You found the carabinieri. There was a butcher's shop opposite, and I asked if I could use their phone. They just looked at me and said, no, the phone's out of order.
No one was willing to talk. The police could do little to combat the carnage. That was about to change. In Palermo, 5 magistrates formed a special unit to combat the mafia. The driving force was Judge Giovanni Falcone. Falcone had grown up in a rundown area of old Palermo, an area that had become a breeding ground for future mafiosi. But Falcone was brought up to respect the law, as his sister recalls.
Our parents had a big influence in the way we grew up, particularly in shaping Giovanni's character. Above all, in our household, patriotism and the love of our country were the most important values in life.
Falcone fought the mafia from the Palace of Justice in Palermo. Even here, he lived in fear for his life. The authorities provided him with little protection. Known mafiosi wandered freely through its corridors. Liliana Ferraro was a close friend and colleague of Falcone in the war against the mafia. One day, from her office in the Ministry of Justice in Rome, she paid Falcone a visit.
I
went to Giovanni's office, knocked on the door, and he was just asking an old man to leave. Giovanni seemed very short with him, and I thought this was a bit strange. Later, he explained the man was a known mafia collaborator who'd managed to get into his office.
Falcone had a simple tactic for combating the mafia. Heroin was being smuggled from Sicily to America. Dollars were flowing in the opposite direction. If he could uncover the paper trail of this dirty money, he would be able to mount a criminal case against the mafia's leaders. The trail led to the US, where the American mob sold the heroin smuggled in by the Sicilian mafia. This is home movie footage, shot in Brooklyn in the mid-1950s. But this was no ordinary American family. Dominic Montiglio was raised by his uncle, Nino Gaggi. Gaggi was a senior mobster with the Gambino crime family, one of the most powerful of America's mafia families. Uncle Nino introduced Montiglio to crime. By the late 70s, Montiglio was also a Gambino mobster, using this Manhattan restaurant as a base to deal drugs.
They used to call this restaurant my headquarters. I would sit and do business here, everything from the drug business to my loan shark business. I felt very secure here. I always had a place to stash my weapons.
Montiglio witnessed firsthand how heroin brought together the American and Sicilian mafias, uniting them by a common desire to make money.
When the heroin was involved, the Americans and the Sicilians would hold hands and do the deals, you know, do business together. But other than that, we had very little to do with them.
But mafia bosses faced a dilemma. They loved the money heroin brought, but they feared the long jail sentences handed down for dealing. They were scared that faced with decades in jail, their men would break omertà, the sacred vow of silence.
It was like, don't get caught. You know, we want to ask where the money came from. Just don't get caught. And it wasn't about they had something against dealing drugs. They just had something against the heat that the drugs bring.
The mob bosses were already too late. The heat was just about to arrive. The Sicilian mafia was making billions of dollars a year trafficking heroin into the US. For American crime fighters, it was time to break these Sicilian gangs. It was a fight that took place on the streets, led by men like DEA agent Frank Panessa. Panessa worked deep undercover. Using an assumed surname, he had posed as a taxi driver to infiltrate crime operations in New York. He'd observed Sicilian gangsters from New York driving down to Philadelphia. When two Philadelphia mafiosi were arrested, Panessa told them, "Go to jail or get me in with the Sicilians." Panessa would have to con the Sicilians into thinking he was a mafia godfather.
The two informants that we had selected a restaurant in South Philly, which was a known mob hangout, and we went there for dinner with the Sicilians. I sat in between the two made Italian guys here in Philly, and when the food came out, they would serve me first. And so the Sicilians were looking at this. They knew, men of honor, that I must be somebody.
Panessa's targets were two Sicilian brothers, Paolo and Giovanni Laporta. This DEA surveillance footage, secretly shot outside a pizzeria in Philadelphia, shows them with Panessa. The first step was done. Panessa was in. Now his con took off.
I told them I had an import-export company. And so when they would come down to visit, we would rent trucks, okay? And we'd have the metallic stickums from the side of the trucks, and we would put them on the side of the trucks, and it said Prima Import Export, Trevose, Pennsylvania. So when they pull into the parking lot, they would see my fleet of trucks. And they thought, well, this must be a legitimate business.
Panessa upped the ante. He said he also had an office in Germany, which they could use to funnel heroin into the US. Giovanni Laporta was eager to see it for himself. So the DEA arranged for their German counterparts to set up a branch of Panessa's phony business.
In the airport, this big burly German comes up to me and hugs me, and he says, "Frank, so good to see you." I've never met him in my life, you know, and I introduced him. He introduced himself to Giovanni, and we go out to this big Mercedes-Benz that's outside, and he says, "Look what Frank got me for Christmas," you know, and we get into the Mercedes-Benz, and we drive to this company. That's Prima Import Export. We go in the door, and here's this young, blonde Fraulein comes up to me and hugs me. Says, "Frank, so good to see you. Here are the cookies that you like." And she had a tray of homemade cookies.
Panessa's bold deception paid off. He had uncovered a massive criminal conspiracy. The Laporta brothers told Panessa that they could launder $5 million a day. In other words, over $1 billion a year. And their business was not just confined to heroin. The brothers told him they also controlled 75% of cocaine distribution on the East Coast.
Paolo Laporta came down to Philadelphia, and I met with him in one of the pizza shops. And on the table was 30 kilos of cocaine. And he says, here, take a few kilos. I said, well, you know, I'm not into that. You know, I'm doing the other stuff, meaning the heroin, and I'm not into the coke, you know. And Paulo's, I guess it was his son, it was like a little 6-year-old, was standing there. And I said, I feel in a slang term, I said skumbari, which means I felt itchy that the little kid was down here, you know, and looking at all this dope on the table. And so he said to the little kid, what do you see? And the kid, in true mafia form, said, I see nothing. And that threw me for a loop. He was, you know, mafia in training.
Panessa secretly tracked the Laporta brothers for 9 months as they ferried heroin between Sicily, New York, and Philadelphia. Both men would eventually serve lengthy prison sentences. With such astonishing amounts of money at stake, Panessa was in little doubt what his fate would be if he'd been discovered. Those who got out of line were murdered and their bodies disposed of. Gangster Henry Hill was a regular participant in operations to get rid of the mafia's victims.
We usually buried them. A few times we threw them in a fucking lot somewhere, you know, just leaving the cars and have them chopped up. And just bring the car down to the junkyard. Put 2 of them a couple of times in the trunk, and they get smashed and go to Japan and make ashtrays out of them. The easiest places to bury bodies was in our clubs, you know, in the basement, of course. We just dug the hole and right there, and put the body in lime, and it would disappear in, you know, a matter of months. Forget about it.
This African-American church used to be a mafia bar run by a killer called Roy DeMeo.
This was probably the most notorious bar in Brooklyn. It was the headquarters for the DeMeo crew. I'd say 70% of their murders were done at this location. You always were scared to be around this crew. I don't care who you were. There was always a certain apprehension.
In Sicily, terror was nothing out of the ordinary. Somewhere on the island lurked the man running the heroin trade to the US, the godfather of the Sicilian mafia, Tito Riina. Riina had murdered his way to the top of the Sicilian mafia to seize control of the heroin trade to the US. Hundreds of people may have been killed on his orders. Few in Sicily had the courage to stand up to him. One who did was prosecuting magistrate Judge Giovanni Falcone. From his office in the Palace of Justice in Palermo, Falcone and a handful of brave colleagues waged a lonely and dangerous war against the mafia.
Pronto. Qui Falcone.
Help was about to arrive. In May 1982, the Italian government sent an army general to Sicily with orders to crush the mafia. But not long after arriving, he was gunned down in the city center, his young wife by his side. Sicilians rose up in outrage. At their funeral, the coffins of the 2 victims were applauded. But outside the church, the politicians who attended the funeral were jeered and spat on, blamed by ordinary Sicilians for tolerating the mafia for so long. In response, the Italian government finally provided Falcone with the backing he needed. Liliana Ferraro was a long-standing friend and colleague in the fight against the mafia. The Ministry of Justice in Rome sent her to see what Falcone needed. She was appalled at the conditions that Falcone worked in.
The first thing I noticed was an old metal desk. There was a chair with a leg missing that was totally buried in paperwork, and a pile of files holding it all up. Giovanni said to me, "This is our office. These are our tools. This is our model of efficiency. If you think you can manage here, then fair enough."
Falcone set about his task of fighting Totò Riina with renewed vigor. He was on the verge of a breakthrough. The net was closing in on two godfathers, both of them closely associated with Totò Riina. It sparked a chain of events that would lead to the mafia's biggest defeat ever. In the United States, FBI agents charged with destroying heroin trafficking from Sicily were onto something. The FBI tapped phone calls made from Knickerbocker Avenue in Brooklyn, home to many suspected Sicilian mafiosi. The mafia used public phones to arrange their deals, unaware that the FBI had them under observation. This is surveillance footage, secretly recorded by the FBI. But the calls were conducted in the Sicilian dialect, incomprehensible even to most Italians. They were also in code. Shirts, for example, meant heroin. Help was at hand in the form of FBI agent Carmine Russo. Russo was born in Sicily and emigrated to the US as a boy, later joining the FBI. Like the Sicilian prosecutor Giovanni Falcone, he had grown up with a deep loathing of the mafia. Russo could understand Sicilian and soon picked up mysterious references to the boss of the operation.
He was not being called by his name. He was either called the shepherd, the uncle, the professor, anything other than his name. That, of course, piqued my interest.
Investigators couldn't identify him until the Sicilians made a mistake that blew open the case. On the phone, the Sicilians talked about Italian newspaper reports of the killing of mafiosi in South America. Those reports mentioned a mafia don called Gaetano Badalamenti. Badalamenti was once a major player, the former boss of the Sicilian mafia. During the war for control of the mafia, he had been on the losing side. He had fled to Brazil in fear of his life. From there, he was importing millions of dollars worth of heroin into the US. Surprisingly, it was a business he ran under the orders of the man who had overthrown him as boss, Totò Riina. In Sicily, it was clear, Riina didn't let hatred of an enemy stand in the way of making money.
Once the FBI determined that we were dealing with a former boss of all bosses of the Sicilian mafia, the goal of the investigation turned its attention to Gaetano Badalamenti.
The investigation heated up. The US Justice Department sent in top crime fighter Richard Martin. Martin was a fluent Italian speaker with years of experience fighting organized crime.
They said, you know, this is like hooking the shark. When you bring the shark onto the boat, you got to be sure that you can kill the shark. And what I meant was, if we bring this guy in, we've got to be sure that we can convict him.
In mid-1983, the FBI made a crucial breakthrough. Agents had become suspicious of a Sicilian pizzeria owner called Pietro Alfano, who lived in the tiny town of Oregon, Illinois, 100 miles west of Chicago. When they ran a check, they made an astonishing discovery.
Hello? Hi, Fadiggio.
Alfano was the nephew of Gaetano Badalamenti. The two Sicilians spoke in code on the phone to arrange heroin deals.
Okay.
But Alfano could never remember what the code was.
I refer to Badalamenti's nephew, Alfano the Buffono, because he was a complete idiot. I mean, Badalamenti was the type of person that talked in code and all that. But Alfano forgot what the codes meant. And he would tell him to go to a certain place, and he couldn't remember what the code was for that place. But Badalamenti didn't have any choice. He depended on him for the distribution out of the Midwest.
The frustration with his nephew boiled over. Badalamenti ordered him to a meeting. In his anger, he blurted out the location, the Spanish capital, Madrid. Law enforcement pounced. In April 1984, both men were arrested by Spanish police. This is footage of them being led away. Badalamenti is the man on the left of this picture. He was sentenced to 45 years in prison, guilty of trafficking $1.6 billion worth of heroin into the US in just 5 years. Investigators had cut the mafia's main heroin supply line. After that, the trail went cold. Badalamenti refused to break the mafia's vow of silence.
If you would like to give us the information we require, I'm sure it's possible to come to some arrangement.
He would not betray the mafia boss controlling the heroin trade to the US, Toto Riina. What happened next would make history. In Brazil, another mafia don was under arrest. A friend and drug-dealing partner of Badalamenti called Tommaso Buscetta. He had also fled Sicily to escape Toto Riina. In Riina's war to seize control of the mafia, he had killed 2 of Buscetta's adult sons. The Italians asked for Buscetta's extradition, but he was determined never to return to Italy. He was sure that Riina would kill him and his new family. So he swallowed a vial of strychnine that he had been secretly carrying with him since his arrest. The poison failed. He emerged from a coma and was put on a plane to Italy. Still seriously ill, he had to be helped down the plane steps at Rome Airport, protected by a bulletproof blanket. Buscetta came to a momentous decision. If the Americans would protect his family, he would wreak his revenge on Riina, but not by the traditional mafia method of murder.
What he wanted in exchange for cooperating with the Italians, with the Americans, with anybody, was to protect his family. He didn't ask for a reduction of his sentence. He didn't ask for any special treatment. The only thing he wanted was to be sure that his family would be safe.
In Rome, Buscetta began to talk. revealing the murderous secrets of the mafia. Buscetta would become the most senior boss ever to break the mafia's sacred tenet, the vow of silence. He would reveal the secret world of the mafia to Judge Falcone, the prosecutor who had waged a lonely battle against the mafia for years. Between July and September 1984, Buscetta spoke non-stop. The words spoken here are taken from the actual transcripts of Buscetta's interrogation.
All the Palermo families are involved in drug trafficking. The closer you are to the boss, the more profits you keep.
What he was really able to do was describe how the mafia operated, both in the United States and Sicily, how the two worked together, and how mafia rules enabled an organization that was spread around the world to function.
Buscetta explained that the key to their success was the strict military discipline of the mafia.
At the head of each family is a capo. He's elected by the men of honor.
Somebody could pick up the phone in Sicily, call Oregon, Illinois, have a 30-second conversation and make a contract that would be binding.
Lower down, soldiers are organized into groups of 10 with a captain over them.
He could explain how different people dotted around the world could take responsibility for different parts of the narcotics business and make it work.
It worked because all mafiosi were bound by an oath taken at a secret initiation ceremony, an oath which, if broken, would have dire consequences.
His finger is pricked, and his blood is spilt on the image of a saint.
He explained that anybody could be a member of the mafia. You know, it could be a priest, it could be a doctor, it could be anybody, so long as he was male and Sicilian. Once they joined, they were bound by the same rules, and the rules were enforced with death.
The image of a saint is placed on the hand, then lit.
As it burns, the novice says, "May my flesh burn like this saint, if I fail to keep my oath."
Buscetta's evidence helped piece together the jigsaw, explaining how a gang of criminals from rural Sicily could run the biggest heroin smuggling operation seen to date in the United States. The law was catching up with the mob. For years, the Sicilian prosecutor Giovanni Falcone had wanted to put the mafia's leaders on trial. The evidence of mafia defector Tommaso Buscetta gave Falcone the chance. Falcone ordered the arrest of almost 400 mafiosi, bosses and soldiers alike. But Tito Riina, the leader of the Sicilian mafia, was not one of them. Now the Italians had to find somewhere to try so many people. There was nowhere big or secure enough in the Sicilian capital, Palermo. The Ministry of Justice decided to build a giant concrete bunker inside the central prison. Falcone's friend from the Ministry of Justice in Rome, Liliana Ferraro, was put in charge. She feared if the mafia found out, they would kill her. Traveling from Rome to Sicily, she went to enormous lengths to stay safe.
Prenotavo l'aereo con un nome diverso, molto elementare.
I booked my flights under a false name, then phoned the foreman of the company building the bunker, and he would pick me up at the airport in his truck. One day I had to go to a funeral in Palermo. I turned up with my black dress covered in builder's dust.
Awaiting the start of the trial, Buscetta was being held in a safe house in the United States, protected day and night by the DEA and the FBI. One day he received a visit from his brother-in-law, but the visit had a sinister purpose, as his guard remembers.
Buscetta was offered a large amount of money not to give testimony. They wanted him to stop. He told the individual he would not. That individual went back and told him that he would not do it, and they just assassinated him. They killed the messenger for it.
In Palermo, the concrete bunker that would house the trial was ready. The walls of the bunker were made of slabs of reinforced concrete, strong enough to repel a missile attack. Inside the courtroom itself, 30 cells housed the defendants. The most spectacular trial in mafia history, the Maxi trial, was about to begin. Falcone would lead for the prosecution. The star witness would be Tommaso Buscetta.
Quando si seppe che Buscetta
When it was confirmed that Buscetta was going to give evidence, we were warned that we could have come under attack from the air. So the skies above the bunker were patrolled 24 hours a day.
The trial began in February 1986. 3,000 armed soldiers guarded the bunker, plus an army tank. Nearly 500 defendants were scheduled for trial, perhaps 10% of the Sicilian mafia, charged with murder, drug trafficking, and other serious crimes. The defendants repeatedly disrupted the proceedings. Only when Buscetta appeared did silence reign. He was on the witness stand for a week, protected by bulletproof glass, repeating what he had already told Judge Falcone.
He really believed that at some point in time, the Sicilians would kill him. He did what he had to do testifying-wise. When we got back on the plane to come to the United States, we were sitting up on top of the 747 in the upper deck, and he said to me, Tony, he said, I didn't believe I was ever coming back.
On the 16th of December, 1987, the judge pronounced his verdict. 344 mafiosi were found guilty, receiving a total of nearly 3,000 years in prison. The trial had taken 22 months from beginning to end. The Maxi trial was the crowning moment for Sicilian prosecutor Giovanni Falcone. Italian and American crime fighters had scored stunning successes against the mafia. It opened the floodgates to mafiosi wishing to flip to the government. Omertà, the vow of silence that for decades had given the mafia its ruthless discipline, was dying. The jailing of scores of top mafia bosses by American and Italian crime fighters threw the mob into crisis on both sides of the Atlantic. Hundreds of mafiosi were now willing to rat on their former comrades. It was extortion that caught up with Dominic Montiglio. He was arrested at gunpoint in a New York restaurant. The police had been hunting him for years. He was imprisoned in the Metropolitan Correction Center in New York. He knew that his mob bosses were terrified he would testify against them. Montiglio feared for his life.
My attitude was, you know, I'm not going to die in here for nothing and leave a wife and 3 children to fend for themselves. You know, I'm just not going to die for their paranoia that I might talk, you know. So in a funny kind of way, I think that they push you in that direction by their actions. You know, I mean, today it's like if you get arrested, they want to whack you out.
Montiglio was brought up to live and die by the mafia's vow of silence. Now, he decided to cooperate with the law. As a young man, he had seen action in Vietnam. Betraying his family and background would be worse.
Testifying in court is like, I'd rather be doing tours in Vietnam than that, you know, because it's like really, you know, it's hard to explain, you know, when you're up there and they're sitting 15 feet away, all of them staring at you, you know, and it's a tough deal. It really is. It's a tough deal to live with. They brought my 90-year-old grandmother in on crutches, cousins, uncles, aunts. They bring in everyone to shake you up. And, you know, that's like every day going into that courtroom is like the first time. You know, it doesn't get any easier.
Elsewhere in New York, the net closed on other gangsters too. Henry Hill was in big trouble. The FBI wanted to question him about a $6 million airport robbery. The Justice Department wanted to know about the murder of an Italian financier. The Brooklyn Attorney's Office needed information about an unidentified body that had been found. On top of it all, he faced a life sentence for dealing drugs. He decided to cooperate.
The government arrested me as a material witness, and I started to cooperate. Because I knew I would have to do life or get a bullet in the head. I knew I was a dead man.
When they found out, the Sicilians tried to lure him to this Brooklyn pizzeria to have him murdered.
But I still get shivers when I'm standing here. This could have been my resting place. Believe it or not, I'm still nervous. I haven't been nervous in a while. I'm just gonna seriously, I don't know how many of those guys' cousins live in this neighborhood still, you know. These are pockets of, you know, of crews, you know, that are here 50 years, you know. It's changed quite a bit, but there's always someone with their eye out a window over here.
You definitely feel that you've betrayed your background, your family, yourself, you know. I can say that after years, you know, you come to grips with it, but that's not to say that it doesn't bother you.
Montiglio and Hill would spend their subsequent years in witness protection, living in secret locations, hundreds of miles from their boyhood homes, always fearing what might happen if their old mafia crews caught up with them.
All in all, that whole experience is something you'd love to forget, but you never could. I mean, I have a recurring dream where I leave Nino's house and his Cadillac is parked in the driveway. And when I walk out the door, I'm walking up the driveway, and Nino, Roy, Chris, Anthony, Joey, they're all hidden under Nino's Cadillac. And as I'm walking by, Roy looks at me and goes, "Hey, Dominic, come to hell with us. And then the dream stops.
The heroin trafficking empire, built up over several decades by the mafia, was dealt a massive blow. Off the coast of Sicily, Italian police search fishing boats for drugs. They find very little. But on both sides of the Atlantic, the war against the mafia was far from over. During his interrogation by Falcone, mafia defector Tommaso Buscetta had a warning for the Sicilian prosecutor. The mafia would stop at nothing to kill him.
Never forget, when you open an account with the mafia, it will only be settled when you die.
Hundreds of mafiosi had been sent to jail in the Maxi trial. But the boss of bosses, Totò Riina, was still free. He still controlled his vast criminal empire. He still murdered his rivals. In the US, the Pizza Connection had been destroyed by the biggest FBI effort ever. 21 Sicilian heroin traffickers had been jailed for sentences of up to 45 years each. Never again would the Sicilian and the American mafias work so closely together. In the 1960s, the history of the mafia changed forever when the Sicilian mob began flooding the United States with an illicit and lethal narcotic: heroin. Heroin would turn the mafia into a global organization and make them more money than they had ever made before. But it would also sow the seeds of their own destruction. A battle would rage on the streets between a new breed of ruthless mafioso and a new kind of policeman prepared to risk everything to infiltrate the mafia for the first time. This was a war over billions of dollars, millions of lives, and the future of America itself. In the late 1960s, drug addiction in the American cities was on the increase, and crime was rising. The government was forced to take action. In 1971, President Nixon declared war on drugs. Just a year later, law enforcement won a major battle by breaking up the Marseille-based heroin racket known as the French Connection. These French laboratories were supplying America with so much of the drug that the bust led to a heroin famine on the streets. What nobody knew was that this success would lead to disaster. Shutting down the French Connection was indirectly opening the door to something every bit as dangerous: the Sicilian Mafia. In the coming years, they would fill the gap in the market and forge a relationship with the most feared mafioso in America, Carmine Galante. In 1974, 2 years after the French Connection was busted, Carmine Galante walked out of prison, ready to flood America with a new source of heroin and turn the mafia into a global drugs corporation. Galante was a member of the mafia family known as the Bonanos. He had a long history of drug trafficking and an even longer history as a tough guy. His personality could be summed up by an incident at Lewisburg prison, where he was serving a sentence for drugs trafficking.
During telephone days, when inmates line up to use the telephone, he was in a section which had some of the toughest black inmates you've ever seen. Murderers, strong-arm artists, you name it. And he would simply walk to the head of the line, grab the phone out of some black inmate's hand and said, "Get off the phone." This surrounded by 200 black guys. No one dared touch a hair on his head.
When Galante got out of prison, the Bonanos were in crisis, their leadership either exiled or in prison. With no challengers prepared to take on this dangerous man, the Bonanos had their new boss. Galante's top priority was to kickstart the heroin trade. In 5 short years, he transformed the fortunes of the US Mafia by leading it into an era of multi-billion-dollar profits and unparalleled violence. Galante was now in the perfect position to build a heroin business even bigger than the French Connection. He was head of the Bonanno family, and now the heroin trade was moving to Sicily, where Galante had his roots. Galante was born in New York, but his family came from the town of Castellammare del Golfo in the northwest of Sicily. Sicilians had been emigrating to America for 100 years, but many of their descendants kept strong links with their homeland. Galante was no exception. His plan was to exploit his close ties with the Sicilian Mafia to dominate the American heroin trade. This was the beginning of a whole new era in the history of the Mafia. Until now, the Sicilian and American Mafia had mainly operated as separate organizations. With the French connection broken, the Sicilian Mafia decided to fill the gap in the market, and there was no bigger market than America. The Sicilians set up a sophisticated smuggling system. Pakistani suppliers shipped partially refined opium from Asia via Turkey to a rendezvous point off the coast of Sicily. A transmitter on the seabed alerted the Sicilians when the drug ships had arrived. Then a powerboat would speed out to meet it, returning with the drugs under cover of darkness. The opium base was processed into heroin in laboratories on the west of the island. 3 Sicilian bosses ran this growing trade, but one of them was far more ambitious, far more greedy, and far more dangerous than the others. Totò Riina. Riina planned to shake up the Sicilian Mafia, just as Galante was making waves in America. The Sicilian Mafia always claimed they adhered to a code of honor, murdering only when necessary, and avoiding the killing of innocents, women and children. But Riina shunned these old guard rules.
Dottor Riina è stato sempre un personaggio molto rumoroso, molto rumoroso.
Totò Riina had always been a loud person, very, very noisy.
Ha fondato il suo potere sul terrore.
He was an extremely violent person and someone who had founded his empire by terror.
Riina was as ambitious as he was ruthless. He was determined to become the boss of bosses, head of the Sicilian Mafia. To achieve this, he would commit so many atrocities that he became known simply as the Beast. In the early 70s, his factories were producing ton after ton of pure heroin. All of it needed to be sold. On the other side of the Atlantic, Carmine Galante and the American Mafia could see that there were huge sums to be made selling Sicilian heroin. But there was also a problem. Throughout its history, the US Mafia had vowed never to be associated with drugs. The Chicago mob, known as the Outfit, was one of the most vocal opponents of the drugs trade.
We always knew that if you dealt with drugs, it was a dirty business. And it'd be like you're feeding your own kid. narcotics, so it was like taboo. And if you got involved with it, you're definitely going to get whacked.
As far as the outfit was concerned, there was no need to deal drugs when money could be made in more acceptable ways. In the 1970s, Frank Carlotta was sent to Las Vegas to make sure nobody messed with the outfit's highly profitable casinos. For Carlotta and his crew, running casinos earned them respect in a way drugs never would.
Actually, it was great. It was beautiful. I mean, you had everything you needed out there. You had anything you wanted to do. You movie stars. So they wanted to be involved with you. You wanted to be involved with them. Anywhere you went, you got the red carpet treatment. It was like you were respected. I think you were respected. I'm hoping that I wasn't feared, but in some cases you were feared. And if that brought respect, well, then it brought respect.
But for others, the huge profits of heroin dealing were hard to resist. From his beginnings in suburban Brooklyn, Dominic Montilio grew up to be a member of the notorious New York crime family, the Gambinos. He dealt drugs for the mafia for many years.
The word that filtered down, just saying, you know, if you got caught, you know, dealing drugs, you know, it was an immediate death sentence. But the real message that came down was just don't get caught. At that time, I couldn't think of one crew that I knew that wasn't involved in it, because the money was too lucrative to pass up.
The mob didn't want to be seen to be peddling drugs, but they were happy to take the money.
I mean, the reason, there was no great moral reasons why they didn't want you dealing in heroin. It was just that it would bring that much more heat on the family. But the bottom line is the cash, you know, and that's a cash business. And the amounts are staggering, the amounts of money that can be made.
The New York families knew that dealing drugs would attract attention from the authorities, but it was a risk they were prepared to take. The US Mafia secretly embraced the heroin trade and was soon making more money than they knew what to do with.
The unpleasant fact is that there is a new epidemic of heroin use in the United States.
As Sicilian heroin began to flow, addiction rates in America soared. At the end of World War II, America had an estimated 20,000 heroin users. By the mid-70s, there were more than 500,000. The FBI had little idea how such large quantities of drugs were getting into the country, or who was bringing it in. But that was about to change. In the 50s and 60s, FBI agents were mostly white males. Now the FBI was recruiting from a much wider pool. Finally, they had young, ambitious agents who came from the communities that were home to the mafia and could speak the Sicilian dialect. One such man was Joe Pistone, better known as Donnie Brasco. Joe Pistone was a young FBI agent from a Sicilian background. His mission was to infiltrate the mafia, something that had never been done before.
I grew up in New Jersey, and I grew up in an Italian neighborhood. And in this neighborhood, there were mafia guys, mob guys, and I went to high school with sons of mob guys. So I knew about the mafia growing up. It wasn't foreign to me when I became an FBI agent. So I was pretty well versed in the ways and traditions of the mafia.
Joe Pistone's dream was always to be a cop.
Growing up would have been easy to go crooked or become bent because you're in the neighborhood, you see what's going on. There are guys doing illegal activities. But I never had an inkling to go toward that because of my parents. I mean, I know if I ever did anything wrong that I get a good swift boot in the rear end from my father.
On July the 7th, 1969, Pistone was sworn in as a special agent of the FBI. 7 years later, he disappeared from everyday life and developed a new identity.
Everybody needs a legend, and that's a history, a legend, a history. And so, you know, you pick a name, and I picked Donnie Brasco, and I picked a jewel thief, burglar, jewel thief, because it's a profession that is not involved in violence. You know, not many jewel thieves are in jail for murder. So you want a legend that is a non-violent legend, and you want one where you can provide somebody with something. So I could come around with precious gems, jewels, and tell them that I had just pulled a score.
Pistone's job was to work his way into a mafia family. The risks were great, but if he pulled it off, he had the chance to expose a secret world of crime. One wrong move, and he faced almost certain death.
In order to do this job, undercover work, you have to have two things. You got to have a lot of nerve, and you got to have a lot of mental toughness. I'm not a person that sweats, you know. When I get into a jam, I don't sweat, so you don't know if you're scaring me or not, you know. And, you know, there's not much that can be done to you. The worst thing that can happen is they can kill you. That's about it.
The FBI wanted the inside story on the mafia. The Bonanno boss, Carmine Galante, was their first target. Pistone used the FBI's diamonds and his Sicilian roots to gradually infiltrate Galante's mafia family.
Being of Italian ancestry and knowing the streets and knowing how the mafia operates, you know, you speak when you're spoken to. You mind your own business. You don't get involved in conversations that don't concern you. They don't just, you know, embrace you and take you in. And you have to just lay back, be patient, and work your way. You know, and it's the first impression that's gonna carry you through. And if you do things, certain things that they pick you out, that you have street smarts and you are a street guy, that's what's gonna make you.
The fuzzle's right on the table. It's ready to take.
In March 1977, Pistone began to hang around in known Bonanno territory. He soon got noticed by mafia foot soldiers. One of the wise guys Pistone met was Lefty Ruggiero. Pistone would later discover that Lefty was a known hitman for the mob. Lefty approached Pistone, asking him to sell some stolen jewelry.
I was introduced to a fellow by the name of Lefty Ruggiero, and Lefty was a 24-hour gangster. I mean, he knew the mob, he knew everything about the mafia. If you need a teacher in the mafia, Lefty was the guy that you wanted. I used my street smarts and my knowledge of the mafia, and I didn't push with him as far as questions and, you know, trying to get the information. And he liked that. He saw that I was a street guy, that I knew the streets, and also, you know, being a jewel thief and bringing around some precious stones, he liked that too, because it was money, you know.
As his undercover operation stretched into months and years, Pistone gradually became an accepted face within the mob. But the risks remained high. Former gangster Henry Hill knows all about the dangers that Pistone faced.
I mean, he was susceptible to get figured out at any time, you know. I mean, it took balls. Believe me, it took balls. But he also enjoyed it. You know, he became a member, or as close as you can come as a member.
Pistone's cover story was tested to the limit one night when he was taken to a mob hangout and interrogated by two mafia soldiers.
I didn't get along with these guys. They didn't, you know, personalities clashed or whatever. The one guy says, look, we're not too convinced that you say you are who you are, you know, a jewel thief, a burglar. And if you don't convince us, you know, you're not going to leave here alive. So we were in there for maybe 5.5, 6 hours, you know, me trying to convince them that I was really Donnie Brasco. I gave him a phone number of a guy in Miami that was supposed to vouch for me, or just vouch for Donnie Brasco. That's all he knew. So one of them went out. He came back about a half hour later, and he said, "Okay, you're all right."
Pistone was so convincing, an almost father and son relationship developed between him and Lefty.
He did have an affection for me, I think, because he saw me, you know, something that he might have wanted to have been, or his son, you know, to have been. And he introduced me to his family and his wife, and I spent a lot of times at his house having dinner. So it became more than just a, you know, gangster on gangster relationship.
By the summer of 1977, Pistone had won Lefty's trust. But would he ever get any closer to heroin boss Carmine Galante?
I was with Lefty one night, and he said we gotta go somewhere. And I said, well, where we're going? And he said, well, I'll tell you when we get there. Galante was having a meeting in there, and it was our job to stand outside and make sure that the meeting went smooth and nothing happened. Basically, we were outside guarding them.
This was a big opportunity for Pistone.
And I asked him, I said, you know, can't we go inside? And he says, what are you, crazy? You can't go in there and sit down when the boss is meeting. You can't even meet the boss. You know, he doesn't meet anybody on your level. He says, we got to stand out here until we're told, till they release us, till we're told we can go. You know, it was kind of an adrenaline rush. A lot of things go through your mind, but the main thing is that if I get killed, I'm going to get killed as a wise guy, not as an FBI agent here. You know, here I'm an FBI agent working undercover, and you know, nobody ever got to be close to a boss, let alone guard him.
Pistone did not get as close to Galante as he wanted, but he learned important facts about his operation. Before Pistone went undercover, the FBI had some idea about the inner workings of the mob. Now, for the first time, an agent was able to confirm the way the mafia was organized from the inside. Pistone told the FBI how each family was structured into a military formation. At the top was the head of the family. Working directly for him was an underboss and an advisor, known as a consigliere. Beneath them were the capos, each of whom ran a crew of 5 to 10 foot soldiers. This structure meant the boss was always several layers away from the foot soldiers and the crimes they committed, making it almost impossible to convict the head of the family. This was vital intelligence in the war against the mob, but it was just the beginning. Pistone also managed to find out the secret of Galante's meteoric rise within the New York Mafia.
Joe came back to us telling us about Sicilians whom the American mafia figures were referring to as zips. And to him, this meant that these Sicilian mafia figures within the Bonanno family were actually being used to commit murder, dealing in drugs, heroin. That was a just unbelievable revelation. I met some Sicilian that were members of the mafia, and these guys were made guys over in Sicily and then brought over here. But the Sicilians had their own clique over here in the U.S.
Galante had imported his own private army of ruthless Sicilian mafiosi.
Galante's two key guys that he brought over were Cesar Bonaventure and Baldo Amato. And he brought them over from Sicily, and they were with him constantly. And I think one of the reasons why he did bring them over is that he felt a better sense of security with the Sicilians, because I guess he felt they were still loyal to the tradition. They They weren't Americanized yet.
Galante's new bodyguards made waves in the Bonanno family.
There was a lot of friction, I found, between the American mafia and the Sicilians, even though they were married up into one family. I mean, anyway, Lefty and Sonny and the other Americans thought that they were looking to take over the family, and that the other American mafia guys didn't trust them and didn't like them.
The Sicilian and American mafia were cut from very different cloth. In the past, the Sicilians had embraced rules and traditions, but that was changing.
They'd kill anyone, you know, where we had certain rules. You know, it sounds strange, but there were rules as to, you know, who you had to get permission from to go do a piece of work, or you couldn't kill a guy in front of his family, and you know, they didn't have those rules.
These new, ruthless Sicilians were from a mafia clan based in Corleone, a remote rural town deep in the mountains of Sicily.
Corleone mafiosi are made of different stuff. They're tough, very hard. Probably their peasant lifestyle trained them to withstand anything thrown at them. Jail doesn't scare the Corleonesi. They aren't frightened of death. They're always faithful to their boss.
The Corleonesi had reached the top of the Sicilian mafia by breaking rules and killing without permission from anyone. In the American mafia, obedience to your superiors was deeply ingrained. The godfather of the American mafia, Charlie Lucky Luciano, had formed an organization known as the Commission back in 1931. This was like the board of directors of the mafia. All the heads of the families would meet to settle disputes and decide on strategy. The Commission imposed discipline on the warring families. Rules were agreed, which changed little over decades. One of the rules was that you didn't kill someone without permission from the head of your family. Las Vegas mobster Frank Carlotta nearly paid the ultimate price when this rule was broken, thanks to his ruthless boss, Tony Spilotro.
I grew up with this Tony guy. He was a very good friend, and as I said, you know, very good friends are the ones that are going to get you killed. And when he had ordered me to whack some guy out here, I asked him, "Did you get the okay from back home?" And he said, "Yeah," and he promised me he did. Well, he never did get the okay from home. And he got a call from one of the bosses back there, and they said, "What are you guys doing out there?"
Killing someone without authorization from Chicago was breaking the rules. The punishment was death. Tony Spilotro decided to blame his best friend, Frank Carlotta.
He was lying. He was taking the weight off himself, because he knew that if he didn't, instead he readily ordered me to do these things, that they would whack him in the head. So he shifted everything over to me. That was my best friend. We shined shoes together when we were 12, 13 years old. So all my life. He's the guy that actually was the guy that told me, when I get to be a big man, you're my right-hand man. And I was. But that's the same guy that was going to sell me out to save his ass and get me whacked.
It wasn't long before Tony Spilotro and his mobster brother received deadly punishment at the hands of the mob.
Believe it or not, I felt a little bad for him. Because they were both beaten to death. They weren't shot, they weren't strangled, they weren't knifed. They were physically punched to death or beaten with bats to death, however, you know. And each one was to watch one die, you know. So, I felt bad. There were two brothers at the same time. I grew up with the guy. Even though the guy tried to kill me, I still felt bad.
For all American mafiosi, the rules of the commission were a fact of life and death.
You really never know who to trust. I don't care how close you are with him, if you grew up with him or what. If that's going to be the one that's going to kill you, usually it's your best friend. You do worry about it because, you know, nobody wants to die, you know, and you just have to be a little one step ahead. Well, let me put it like this. You know, most people grow up with only 4 or 5 friends in their lifetime. One day I made a list, and I think I counted up to 56 early. And some were killed by the police. But the majority of them, like 36 or better, were killed by the outfit, the syndicate.
Carmine Galante didn't care about the commission or its rules. He believed the American mafia was soft and that his connections with the ruthless Sicilians made him invincible. But there was more than one advantage of having an alliance with the old country.
At first, nobody thought much about it. But then the rest of the mafia began to get really nervous because they began to ask themselves, now, why is he bringing in so many of these zips? And everybody put 2 and 2 together. These guys are running heroin. This is a Sicilian connection at work here. We don't need this. For one thing, the organization felt we can't control the zips.
Sicilians made and smuggled in the heroin. By hiring them into his own crew, Galante was making sure he would stay at the heart of the heroin business.
For what he was trying to do with in the heroin business, it would have been, you know, good for him to be aligned with the more Sicilians, the better, because that's where the pipeline came from.
In the late 70s, the Sicilian mafia dominated the heroin trade. On the streets of America, the profits being made were reaching $20 billion a year. Galante was trying to keep the profits to himself. Something had to be done.
He was greedy. He wasn't, you know, the Bonanos may have been involved in this, the profits from this drug trade, but Galante wasn't sharing it even with his own people and the family because he was, you know, an egomaniac. You know, he wanted to be the boss, and nobody was going to tell him what to do, and he was going to run his family, and he wanted to run the other families too. And during this time, Galante was making deadly enemies. The other bosses didn't like him because of this attitude that he had, that he was the top boss in the city.
Everyone knew on the street that the clouds of war were right there. I mean, if this guy stayed loose, what he was plotting would have definitely caused major, war to happen between the families.
For mob bosses, the Galante problem was growing. Only the commission had the authority to act. Their solution would be violent. Galante had to go. On July the 12th, 1979, Carmine Galante paid a visit to Joe and Mary's restaurant on Knickerbocker Avenue in Brooklyn. It was one of his favorite haunts. Run by his cousin, he felt safe there. He was joined by his 2 loyal Sicilian bodyguards.
There's a courtyard that you go into, and is an open-air courtyard. And they were sitting down getting ready to have lunch. And Galante was sitting there, and he had his cigar in his mouth. Three guys pull up outside, jump out of a car. They run in the restaurant and start blasting away. Galante ends up getting shot, falls off his chair, sprawls out on the ground, face up, and he still has his cigar clenched in his mouth. And that's how they got Galante.
This is the famous front page that greeted America the next morning. Galante's meteoric rise to the top had ended in a pool of blood.
Carmine Galante was rubbed out today as he sat in a Brooklyn luncheonette, a gangland execution of a man believed to be the most important organized crime figure in the country.
After the murder, the killers fled the scene. But in an amazing coincidence, one of them walked into a club that was under police surveillance. This incredible footage shows him reporting back to the commission bosses after the successful hit. But the feds were about to get an even bigger surprise.
Well, when the police came on the scene, they had immediately identified Carmine Galante's body. He was an old man, had a cigar stuck in his mouth, totally lifeless. As the police pieced everything together, they were told that two other individuals who were in the backyard with Galante, later identified as his so-called bodyguards, they were the ones who miraculously got out of there without any wounds whatsoever.
Forensics found 5 different caliber slugs in Galante, and there were only 3 gunmen. So that leads you to believe that there were 2 guns someplace else. And the only other 2 guys there were Bonaventure and Amato.
Bonaventure and Amato were the 2 key Sicilians Galante had brought over for his own protection.
The police deduced from what they saw at the scene that Bonaventure and Amato were not there to protect Galante. They were there to ensure that his assassination was carried out without a hitch. The ultimate treachery was performed by his own men. The men who were supposed to protect him from any harm, they were the ones who actually helped carry out the assassination.
The Sicilians had turned on Galante. It seemed his greed had upset others besides the commission.
The Sicilians who had arrived in America in the 60s and 70s, who were helping bring in the heroin from Sicily, wanted full control in their hands. The message was, we are bringing it in, we are going to be involved in the distribution network. Therefore, we want a bigger share in the proceeds. And that was the message of the New Sicilians. We are the ones doing it, we want a bigger share. Not what Galante was doing, keeping most of the share for himself.
Galante's murder made the FBI even more suspicious about the Bonanno family. For the commission to whack a boss meant there were big things going on. 2 young agents, Charlie Rooney and Carmine Russo, were given the job of watching the Bonanno Sicilians.
This is the area where myself and my partner Charlie Rooney spent a lot of time conducting surveillance. And we needed to find intelligence that could only be found on the street. And that meant being out here, being the eyes and ears, basically, of the FBI, trying to determine who these Sicilians were and what they were doing.
One Bonanno member who soon came to their attention was Sal Catalano, who ran an Italian bakery in Queens. The FBI realized that Catalano was a key figure in the heroin trade. Suspicious packages were constantly being exchanged, probably containing either heroin or money. The FBI decided to play a waiting game in the hope they could break open the whole operation.
One of the things that we in the FBI, and of course all of law enforcement, wanted to know was how were they bringing the heroin into the United States at that time.
Over the next 5 years, Russo and Rooney's surveillance operation evolved into the largest investigation the FBI had ever undertaken. Finally, after recording and translating more than 55,000 wiretaps, the team of 400 agents worked out how the mafia smuggled heroin into America.
They used their businesses, furniture businesses, construction businesses, marble, things of that nature, in particular the pizzeria business. They needed tomatoes for the sauce.
The mafia had taken over pizzerias across the country and given them to immigrant Sicilians to manage. The operation was controlled by Sal Catalano from his bakery in Queens. This footage shows some of the actual restaurants implicated in the Pizza Connection trial. Restaurants just like these were used to distribute heroin around the country. The heroin arrived in the US through all kinds of routes. Their methods were often ingenious. Cases of canned tomatoes or boxes of cheese arrived from Sicily, stuffed with heroin worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. But the pizza network was not a retail operation. Mafia dealers never sold the heroin directly on the streets. Instead, the imported narcotics were divided up and sold to smaller street dealers. That way, the bosses stayed well away from the dirty end of the business. The pizza restaurants had another use as well. Catalano and his crew could hide their profits by passing them off as restaurant takings.
Pretty ingenious cover. I mean, you know, who figures a pizza place? You know, you figure you see some guy slinging dough around making a pizza. What's he going to be involved in?
Mafia dealer Henry Hill regularly used pizza restaurants for his drug drop-offs.
It wasn't difficult for me. I used to go to a pizza joint in a shopping center, leave my car there, and take a different car home, you know, and I go back 4 days later, you know, and put the money in the trunk.
The evidence the FBI found led to the very top of the mafia and all the way back to Sicily.
Salvatore Catalano was aligned with the Corleonesi in Sicily. That's where the power came from. It was Salvatore Riina, the boss of the Corleonesi. Salvatore Catalano came here with a purpose. The purpose was the Sicilian mafia had a commodity that was being sent to the United States. They needed people here whom they could trust and carry on that activity.
The power of the Corleonesi mafia and their ruthless boss, Salvatore Riina, stretched all the way to America.
Who knows how long they had been doing this before we stumbled onto them. And we basically stumbled onto them. And I believe what did it for them and for us was the Galante murder. Without that murder, I don't think we would have set our eyes on them at the time that we did.
Meanwhile, FBI agent Joe Pistone still had a problem. How to escape alive from his undercover role inside the mafia. Despite Galante's murder, Joe Pistone's dangerous undercover operation continued for 2 more years. But in 1981, his mission came to a dramatic climax. The head of Pistone's mafia crew was a hard man called Sonny Black. Over the years, Black had been impressed with Pistone. Now Sonny decided to honor Pistone by making him a made man, a full member of the mafia. But there was one big catch. Pistone would have to kill someone.
When Sonny Black gave me the contract to do the hit, I mean, you can't refuse it. You have to take the contract, otherwise you're the next guy that's going to get killed, because you know, that's just part of being a mob guy, a mafia guy, is that because you don't do hits on a fee basis. You just do it because you're part of that crew. I accepted the hit. Luckily, the guy that I had the contract on was on the lam because he knew he was going to get killed. But I went looking for him. I went to Florida, back to New York, and couldn't find him because he was in hiding.
In a twist of fate, Pistone was asked to whack one of the men who had assassinated Carmine Galante. But it was not to be. The FBI could not allow an agent to commit murder. On July the 26th, 1981, Pistone was pulled out. The FBI decided to tell Pistone's mafia contacts that he was an undercover agent. These photographs show FBI agents leaving a Bonanno family hangout. They have just told Lefty Ruggiero that his friend Donnie Brasco was an agent. The consequences of this news for the Mafia crew were deadly. In this photo, Sonny Black discusses the FBI's bombshell with his crew. A few days later, he disappeared. The following year, his body was discovered, washed up off Staten Island.
He was in a body bag, and they had chopped off his hands, and that was an indication that he had brought me around to shake hands with mob guys that were of status.
These photos of Lefty were taken just after he found out Pistone was an FBI agent. He knew he was in big trouble. The Mafia would never forgive such a mistake. The Bonannos put out a contract on Lefty Ruggiero, but the FBI found out and snatched him into custody before the killers got to him. Pistone gave evidence against Lefty, and he was sentenced to 20 years. He died of cancer on Thanksgiving Day, 1995.
At least Lefty didn't get clipped, you know. He lived his life in jail. He got what he deserved. I mean, I didn't make Lefty a gangster. I didn't make Sonny a gangster. I didn't make any of these guys gangsters. They were gangsters before I got there. They were gangsters while I was there, and they were gangsters after I left.
Joe Pistone had survived undercover for 6 years.
But I mean, that's a long time to spend undercover with that, with a crew that's, more than capable of killing you and taking you apart, dumping your body's parts somewhere. And to have those guys trust you to a point, I mean, I never heard an FBI guy coming close to getting made. I mean, they were looking to make him.
Got addicted to it, and it took the government a lot of years. And I mean, they got a lot of cases out of it, but it almost destroyed his life, And he thought he was a wise guy, and he thought he was an FBI agent.
After being pulled out, Pistone spent the next 5 years testifying against his Mafia buddies. Then in 1986, he left the FBI to write a book about his experiences. But his life would never be the same again. Even now, he lives under an assumed name, under constant threat of assassination.
The Mafia put a contract out on me when the operation terminated, and I surfaced. My identity showed up. Am I worried about it? I don't think about it every day. Just take precautions and go about living the way I live, and if it happens, it happens, and the best man will win.
Thanks to the efforts of law enforcement agents like Joe Pistone and Carmine Russo, the Pizza Connection investigation seriously weakened the American Mafia. After years of making vast profits from narcotics, it would take much more than that to stop them. No one could have foreseen that in the coming years, the actions of one Mafia boss would change everything and bring the American and Sicilian Mafia to their knees.